Hey everyone, welcome back to Portal of Wisdom. I am back today with another story for you. If you are new to the channel, like and subscribe and click that little post notification bell so you get alerted when I post new videos. And now on to today's topic. So what comes to mind when you hear the name Jesse James? Is it a bank robber, a criminal, Robin Hood, a folk hero, a cold-blooded killer? There are many thoughts people have about Jesse, and the stories are all over the board, from good to bad when it comes to Jesse James. He was kind of a Jekyll and Hyde type of character, but nonetheless, he was and still is an icon, especially in the West. So there are said to be many lost or buried Jesse James and James Gang treasures, but one of them really grabs people's attention. And we're going to go over some of those details. And there is an account that does a really good job of telling the story by Oklahoma historian and author David Ferris. So we'll read some of his account that goes over all the details extremely well. And then after that, we will go over some other things that are going on, places people have looked, and various other things. For more than a century, the rugged landscape east of Cement, Oklahoma in the Etched Hills has been the site of a persistent mystery. As the legend goes, in late 1875, Frank and Jesse James, along with Cole Younger and several other associates, rode into Mexico to do a little work. North of Chihuahua, barely south of the border near El Paso, Texas, the gang took possession of a Mexican gold transport that consisted of 18 slow-moving burros, overburdened with $2 million worth of gold bullion. The team was driven north through Texas and crossed the Red River into the Indian Nation at the time. Presumably, the gang was hoping to return all the way home to Missouri. Unfortunately, when they reached the Wichita Mountains, they were greeted by a winter snowstorm. For 3.5 days, the caravan waded through foot-deep snow, making little progress until they were exhausted. The outlaws had no choice but to make camp until almost springtime. Deep in the Etched Hills, north of Buzzard's Roost, the men found suitable locations to bury the gold. In order to locate the treasure troves on their return, a series of clues were left behind, aligned with specific landmarks. One of those clues was an iron kettle that contained gold, a watch, and most importantly, a coded map. Finally, a burro shoe was nailed to one tree, and Jesse emptied 12 rounds from his 2 revolvers into another nearby cottonwood tree to further distinguish the area. The burros were then turned loose, except for a lame one that was shot, and then the emptied saddle packs were burned as fuel for the campfire. With the treasure safely concealed, the gang made a pact. Although they were outlaws, they were also men of integrity who kept their word and knew what happened to those who didn't. A contract between the outlaws was carved into the side of a brass bucket, and their names were listed below. The brass bucket contract, as it became known, read as follows: This 5th day of March in the year of our Lord 1876, we the undersigned do this day organize a bounty bank. We will go to the west side of the Etched Hills, which is about 50 yards from, and there was an X or crossed sabers. Follow trail line coming through the mountains just east of Lone Hill, where we buried Jack. His grave is east of a rock. This contract made and entered into this 5th day of March 1876. This gold shall belong to who signs below. The names in order read Jesse James, Frank Miller, George Overton, Rub Buse, Charlie Jones, Cole Younger, Will Overton, Uncle George Payne, Frank James, Roy Baxter, Bud Dalton, Zach Smith. The bucket, like the kettle, also contained gold and coded directions to get to the rest of the loot. Jesse then hid it under a rock ledge along the base of Tarbone Mountain. Anyone who broke the deal would answer to him personally. Unfortunately for the James gang, they were dispersed 6 months after the brass bucket contract, when they attempted to rob a bank in Northfield, Minnesota on September 7th. Frank and Jesse got away, but Cole, along with his brothers Bob and Jim, were shot multiple times and captured. 6 years later, on April 3, 1882, Jesse was assassinated by a member of his new gang, Bob Ford. Months later, on October 4th, Frank James surrendered to Missouri Governor Thomas Crittenden. After 2 trials, the famed outlaw was twice found not guilty. He was held on other charges for almost a year until he was pardoned by Governor Crittenden. For the next couple of decades, Frank James worked a series of menial jobs, unlike someone who was sitting on millions of dollars in gold. Of course, his employment may have served as a front while he spent proceeds from past robberies. Regardless of his reasoning, Frank waited until Oklahoma became a state in 1907, when he was 64 years old, before he returned and settled 2 miles north of Fletcher near the Keechee Hills. It is doubtful that the money he used to purchase his 160-acre farm and build a new house for him and his wife Anne came from odd jobs that he had worked in the last 24 years. Cole Younger had already arrived in Lawton a few miles south of Fletcher 4 years earlier, after his release from prison in 1901. The men had work to do. Frank planted a grove of peach trees, but the retired outlaw spent little time as a farmer. His days were spent traversing the drastically developed landscape surrounding the Keechee Hills. Since 1876, the former unassigned Indian land had been opened to white settlers in 1901. The trees and rocks were cleared and the land had been plowed and fenced. Old Civil War trails had disappeared and were replaced by new ones with unfamiliar names. According to the old-timers who knew Frank, he wore out 6 horses searching the hills for decades-old treasure landmarks. The Jameses lived on the farm until 1914, when they returned to Missouri. Frank died the following year. It was alleged that during his time in the Keechee Hills, Frank James had retrieved much of the gold that he sought. If that was the case, then there was also much that he didn't find, including an iron kettle and a brass bucket. So there have been some experts that have recreated parts of the trip with loaded down mules just to estimate the pace and get an idea if the facts fit. And one such experiment over a much smaller length determined that the average pace would be maybe 10 miles per day. Now, with approximately 800 miles to cover in about 80 to 90 days between the robbery and when the gold was said to be buried in the Oklahoma Territory mountains, it seemed that the facts not only fit, but really seemed to fall right into place as expected. It seems totally logical to say they made 800 miles in 80 to 90 days with loaded down burros. So the brass bucket was found in the early 30s by famous treasure hunter Joe Hunter. And then he was up on Buzzard's Roost and he supposedly found Jack. Remember that part where they said, or gave directions from where they buried Jack? Well, Joe Hunter said he found Jack in 1933. And Jack is not a person, but the name Jack is spelled out in black rocks on the ground and mostly visible from a high vantage point like Buzzard's Roost. And I believe he was on Buzzard's Roost when he found it. So Joe Hunter also found the copper map in 1932 on Buzzard's Roost. So this copper map is supposed to also help guide you to the treasure. So it was supposedly the map that Frank James was looking for and had said if he could find that map, then he could find millions in gold. So there are a few supposed copies of the copper map out there, but not many, as it seems the finder let very few copies be made. And it's also said that there are more than one copper map, and they may fit together or have some kind of other secret to the treasure. So it appears that there could still be some treasure that still exists out there in the Oklahoma mountains or hills, and that is the story of one of the biggest scores of the Jesse James gang. Like and subscribe if you like these kind of stories.